I want to start off by building on what you just did, sharing with you what I imagine when I imagine a world beyond racial bias. And it's an image that was given to me by Toni Morrison in her essay in the book edited by Wanimi Libiaba called The House That Race Built. And it's essays on American culture. And Toni Morrison, in her inimitable Toni Morrison way, is asked if she can imagine a post-racial world. And she says, I don't want a post-racial world. I want a world in which race ceases to be the site of harm, but becomes the site of freedom. And then she says, I want a world where a woman can awake at midnight as the moonlight comes through her window and casts its light on her eyes. And she walks down her stairs off her porch and she wanders out into the woods. And as she wanders, she hears the cry of a baby at a distance and walks to her neighbor's house and finds her friend sitting on the front porch with her newborn child. And they sit there together and talk for a while, rubbing the child's tummy, giving her a little milk. And then it's time to put the child to bed. And the woman arises from the porch and steps back into the woods. And she has the freedom to decide, shall she go home or shall she wander further? Because she knows that no one anywhere considers her prey. Toni Morrison. Let me begin by just saying a word of thank you to Jackie and Middle Church for doing this, for Valerie. Jackie, Valerie, and I have all three for now probably 4 years been talking about revolutionary love and have been generating revolutionary love conversations. Also David Kim, his love-driven politics work. I mean, it's been fermenting and growing. This past year I was president of the American Academy of Religion, which is a group of about 10,000 nerdy scholars. We're kind of nerdy. Yes, we are. Who get together once a year to share papers about religion. And when you're president, you get to choose the topic. And this past year, I was president and chose the topic revolutionary love for this conference in San Antonio. And it just so happened, I did not know this when I was elected 3 years ago, that I would be asked to give my address on revolutionary love 1 week after the election. And I've never been more afraid in my life than when I stood up to try to say words and speak words into that space that would have any kind of purchase or significance. And yesterday I pulled out that talk and I read it, and I was amazed by the level of despair that was in it. First of all, I realized in writing it that I could not have imagined in November how quickly Trump would begin to enact his fascistic hate-mongering campaign to dismantle the basic infrastructure, frail as it may be, the basic infrastructure of our country and all that millions have died and struggled for. I agree with you, Valerie, nothing short of the future, the existence of democracy is at stake. Let there be no mistake as we move into these conversations about revolutionary love that this man and his administration and many of his congressional leaders and many, but not all, of his supporters want to crush us, to destroy this work, to destroy our bodies and our lives. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, once reminded us that there are two kinds of wars There are wars of maneuver, which are wars of conquest in which territories are taken. He says those are the most obvious wars. Those are the wars that you win or lose in a period of time. But he pauses, he says there is a more dangerous kind of war, and he calls it war of position. And these are wars that are fought for the territory of hearts and minds and the character of community. It's the war in which real power is exerted and changed. It is a slower war, but it is a much more dangerous and high-stakes war. These wars of position, in the context of thinking about revolutionary love, sisters and brothers, we need to admit we are in the middle of a war. And in many ways, it's a war that has been raging for a long time. Donald Trump has just actually articulated in a particularly loud way the battle cry of an intransigent white supremacy that has been dug deep in the soil of this country for now almost 500 years. So what does revolutionary love at this moment mean? Again, I'm an academic nerd. I'm not a preacher. So when I talk about love, I want to talk about it first in a sort of parsing way to look at what we mean when we throw this term around. As Valerie said, and as Jackie said as well, it's a term we use often, and sometimes we know what it means, and sometimes it comes out of parts of our bodies, and we don't even know what we're saying when we mention it. It's a word that has a long history around the globe in many cultures. In Western culture, it's a term that first got its purchase through Plato with his notion of love as being the some ascending space beyond our bodies and our time, in which we are at one with all and God. But since that time, the word love has gone through transmutations, particularly during the time of the Enlightenment, in which something very important happened to the term love. During the Enlightenment in the West, the world that people live in together was imagined into two distinct separate spheres. There was the public sphere, which was the sphere of work. It was the sphere of reason. It was the sphere where labor happened and economies were built and money was exchanged and empires grew and houses were constructed and roadways were built. This was the public space of men, of white men. And then there was the world of domestic space. And domestic space was the world of white women. The labor of people of color was going underneath all of this division, not even figured into it. But the world of the domestic sphere was the world of white women where love resided, where care happened, where children were born and fed, where luxury and pleasure and things like vacations and religion and time out and the economy of friendship was located. It was the sphere of affect. And that was a sphere that was given to women. That was the sphere that was, by virtue of its connection to the activity of unseen care, attributed to communities of color. And with that attribution, it disappeared from public view as the space of political reflection. And that's how we get to a point today where when we bring up the concept of love, we feel like we're bringing something new back into politics, which is only not there because of a political economy that took it out. And that was directly related to the construction of gender and race in the European West. So what does it mean to step out of that binarism and bring love back into the conversation about how we do our political lives? Well, it means we, as all of us are here today, begin to think beyond these binarisms about interconnectedness, about notions of equal value, taking delight in difference. We begin to understand the earth as not simply the space where we stand, but engage the earth as a partner with us in this thing we called life. It is a place where we come to new understandings of how we know, unconscious bias, knowing our minds are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we are consciously aware of, and that whole embodied reality that we walk around with, that we are communicating for, comes to the fore. It is a world in which we begin to imagine what it looks like for all to flourish. We are at a turning point in human history. Winona LaDuke, Native American activist and writer, who spent the last 6 months at Standing Rock, was with us at Union Theological Seminary Wednesday evening for the Judith Moyer's Women of Spirit lecture. She described this moment as one in which we stand as a people globally with two paths before us. One path is scorched. It is a dead path. The trees have no flower. The ground is covered in ashes, and you cannot see a horizon. And the other path is green, and the trees are growing, and there are people there. You can still see mud and smell dirt. She says, we're at the turning point where we have to choose which path we will walk on, because the path that has brought us to this place is the one that continues to lead us in this direction. Now, one of the things that's hardest for me as I think about revolutionary love and the turning around that it will take to get us collectively to walk down this path is that turning, and that walking is not something that we will see happen in our lifetimes. It's not something that's going to happen fast. It's not going to happen because of next week's protest or next month's policy change. Even those are steps along the way. It will happen because we have a revolution of consciousness. A change in the whole way in which we view and understand our world. I had an unusual experience this last 3 weeks at Union, in which for the last 3 weeks, step by step, we had huge conferences in which we were addressing crucial issues. The first one was on the theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and we were celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, in which Dietrich Bonhoeffer nailed up his thesis and began what we think of today as Protestantism, which is the basis of the theology that this church originated from. And as we talked about Bonhoeffer with people coming from all around the world to explore his legacy, we remembered the legacy of Bonhoeffer, who came to Union in the 20s as a privileged white German man who had his world changed around when he began to attend Abyssinian Church in Harlem and had his heart and imagination swept away by the Harlem Renaissance and returned to Germany, even though he could have stayed in the United States. He returned, he walked back into the fire, and became, as a Christian, part of a group of people who met underground to plot the assassination of Hitler. It was uncovered, he was imprisoned, and he was executed 3 days before the end of the war. But at the end of our conference on what Bonhoeffer would be doing and saying and being today, everyone agreed that even the categories that Bonhoeffer himself imagined no longer work. That Protestantism and the categories that it generated to construe the world based on notions of good and evil, of the saved and the unsaved, need to be thrown away because the world itself is pushing at the edges. Notions of heaven, salvation, the centrality of a notion that only through Jesus are you saved. No, it doesn't work anymore. Now that this was the result of a conference devoted to celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, this is a very good sign. The next week we had a conference, the first one ever in the United States, of Asian and Asian Pacific Islander seminarians and faculty gathering to talk about theological education, about their heritage, and about what it means to move forward. The stories they shared, the imagination that they brought to the conversation about what theological community means and what it means to be a spiritual person, sort of burst open space at Union that hasn't been opened before. And there we saw, even in the sounds and the structure, what it means to move beyond purity categories, what it means to move beyond Western notions of race into cultures where difference has been configured in entirely different ways, and yet where the history of imperialism from the West, but also internal to Asia itself, has been wrestled with for centuries. And at the end of that meeting, the very last conversation was, even amongst the Asian Pacific Islanders, the categories we have used, they do not work. We need to imagine something new because it's not clicking with the reality in which we find ourselves. The student said, we're at Union not because we simply want to dredge up a past heritage. We're struggling to see something new. And then this last week, in fact, part of it's happening today. That's why there's not more Union students in the audience. They would be down here. We're having a conference on sanctuary. We declared ourselves a sanctuary seminary about a month ago, and we're exploring. We're exploring what that means, not just in terms of all of the hard work that goes into putting in place the things that stop any agency from coming on campus, any police agency from coming on campus looking for undocumented people. It stops us providing any kind of information about the status of our students and provides physical sanctuary to those whose lives are at risk. Expanding beyond that begins to think about what would it mean for our whole world to be a sanctuary world. What does it mean to live in a place where, through revolutionary love, we no longer have churches and hospitals and houses of worship and schools as special sites for sanctuary, but rather the world itself is that sacred space where everyone is safe. Again, the sanctuary movement itself is pushing beyond its own categories of what it means to be sanctuary, to push it into the world so that space opens up for new imagining. So I want to say just a little bit more. I had other things I was going to say, but you covered so much about, we're probably going to repeat all of us, each other. But I want to talk about particularly this conference, Revolutionary Love and Racism. And I want to talk about white supremacy. And I want to talk about white supremacy beyond the categories of when the notion of Caucasian came to be in the anthropologist's mind in Western culture, and talk about what it means in the United States. And here, James Baldwin has been tremendously important to me. James Baldwin talks about, he has wonderful, wonderful passages about how whiteness came into existence in America. And he takes the figure of the Swedish farmer who crosses the ocean and comes to this soil not as a white person, but he becomes white through burning indigenous villages and raping Native American women, and then building ships that bring from Africa the bodies of Africans who go to work in fields and spill their blood so that he can make money. He becomes white over a 300-year period in which he constructs the most brutal and torture-bound system of extracting labor from bodies and resources from the earth that the world has ever seen. It is through those practices that white supremacy was built. And it was built on the notion that you had to take these white Europeans and you had to contort them into people capable of such brutality. And you don't do that for 300 years to people and not have that legacy live deep in the bones, not only of the infrastructure of our country and of the walls of all of our buildings, but deep in the white psyche of white people. And inherent in that is notions of white supremacy that have the privilege of not recognizing that the very identity of whiteness itself cannot be extricated from the history of that genocide, that slavery, and the power that it continues to wield to enforce those systems of horror and terror. So the work of revolutionary love has to be the work of dismantling that legacy, which means telling the truth about it. And this week with Winona LaDuke at Union, we were privileged together many of the Native American leaders from New England, particularly the tribes of New York and New Jersey. And one of them, Sachin Stormhawk, who is the head of the Algonquin tribe, said to us all, "You know, I have only met one group of people who has not, in fact, been colonized by this same mindset." Sachin Stormhawk said that. And this was a tribe I met in Brazil last week in the Amazon. But he stood up in front of everyone. He said, "We have to all admit we are part of this sickness. There is no privileged space where you have not been touched by it." Now, for that to come from a Native person who has suffered 500 years of displacement and the rage underneath that was a very powerful moment. So what does it look like for us to go and cure that disease, to choose that green path? I heard yesterday a wonderful quote. Someone asked Duke Ellington what jazz was going to be like 20 years from now. And Duke Ellington responded, he said, "Well, if I knew that, I'd be doing it now." I mean, part of it is, this makes the point that we don't know what it looks like. And we are in a moment of extreme motion and emotion, but we are also in the midst of birthing and changing and creating that thing that is to come. So a few words to end with about what it will take to move towards that green path. And we need to approach it with humility, recognizing at all times the limits of our knowledge, and that we will always learn things from listening to the voices that are at the margins of whatever reality we inhabit. Secondly, we need to give our children the armor they need to live in empire in order to continue the struggle beyond us. Ruby Sales talks about this in her comments on the civil rights movement and reflects on the failure of her as a civil rights activist and all of her friends and all of her fellow colleagues and comrades to recognize in their own movement what a central role music and spirituality played, so that then they did not take it seriously enough in educating the political education of their own children to pass that legacy on. So our children are all out there in the streets with no armor to protect them.